Welcome to RGES High School Grammar. This is lesson on sentence structure part 2. Let me correct that, part 2, but we will also be doing some review on part 1. The first observation I'd like to make as I've looked over your work is that the directions need to be followed carefully. And it says do all your work on your own paper and staple to the handout, staple to this sheet and turn in. So I had a few of you that failed to staple your work to this sheet. So that is important to do. Make sure you do that in the future. The second part of your instructions was make sure that all answers are in complete sentences. So when I ask the question, number 1, define a sentence, I expect an answer that says a sentence is a group of words that express a complete thought, or that expresses a complete thought, not a group of words that expresses a complete thought. That is not a sentence. And this is what you're learning to do, is write incomplete sentences. So I expect that in your answers and marked off accordingly. If in number 2, if it says list the 4 basic sentence structures, I would probably give you grace if you went ahead and did that as a list, but I would expect if you were answering incomplete sentences, even though I asked for a list, that you would say the 4 basic sentence structures are, and then you would list them. Now, that was the problem with mechanics. You want all sentences to begin with a capital letter and end with a period. So I am grading these worksheets on your grammar because that's the task. That's what we're trying to learn. Now, we also had some understanding issues. And so let's try to address some of the major understanding issues. So our first misunderstanding is still fuzzy for some people. We've already defined a sentence, a group of words that expresses a complete thought. Now we have 4 types: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. And reviewing last lesson, you want to understand that a simple sentence has one subject and verb together into one main clause. Okay, we have what we would call, so I would say a simple sentence has one main clause. Another word for a main clause is the independent clause. What's required to have an independent clause or a main clause? These are synonyms to one another. What is required is to have a subject, who or what the sentence is about, and a verb, either an action that the subject is doing or a state that the subject is in. For instance, the father threw the ball. The subject is the father, threw is an action verb. He's doing something. But if I said the father is the president of the college, father is the subject, but is because that is what he is, that's his state of being, is the verb, and in this case it's not an action verb. Okay? But in either way, we have who or what the sentence is about, and what they are doing, or who they are, okay, or what it is if it's not a person. So this is called a main clause or an independent clause if it makes sense by itself. It's a combination of subject and verb that makes complete sense. It is independent. It doesn't need any more. It's not lacking any more information for me to totally understand what you are doing, what you are saying or talking about. So an example of a simple sentence with one subject and one verb could be as simple as the boy ran. Boy is the subject, ran is the verb. It could be complicated, like the little boy in brown with brown hair ran around the block. And I'm not going to write all of that, but still the subject is boy and the verb is ran. It's the little boy ran around the block. Okay. Still, one subject, one verb, one independent clause. That's a simple sentence. It does not have to do with length. It has to do with the content of the words. Now, if I expanded this to another simple sentence that has two subjects in it, I would say Jim and Jack ran. If I want to... So there we have two subjects, as we were asked to do in number 5. Write an example of a simple sentence with a compound subject. That means I'd have two subjects doing the same action. So, Tim and John ran. Number 6, write an example of a simple sentence with a compound verb. That means that I would have a subject doing two verbs. For instance, I would have the boy caught the football and threw it. He caught and he threw, two verbs, and the same subject doing the same verb. I could even have the two subjects doing the same two verbs. Okay. And I still have a simple sentence. In other words, Tim and John caught the football and threw it. So, two subjects, two verbs, but they're the same two subjects doing the same two verbs. And all of that is examples of the simple sentence. Now notice how that is different from the idea that I have a subject, one subject doing one verb, and another subject doing another verb. And I want to put those in the same sentence. For instance, the boy ran and the girl skipped. I have two subjects, but it's different than saying the boy and girl ran. And it's different than saying the boy ran and skipped. And it's different than saying the boy and girl ran and skipped. I have one subject, the boy ran, and a whole different idea, the girl skipped. They're related to one another, otherwise we could never stick them in the same sentence. They have some relationship to one another, but they are separate ideas. And when we have two separate ideas or two independent clauses, it could stand by itself, the boy ran. It could stand by itself, the girl skipped. So this is an independent clause or a main clause, either way. This is an independent clause, and we want to join them together. That is called the compound sentence. Now, this is where you guys are getting a little fuzzy still. Not everybody, but some of you. And so let me go over this very carefully. There are only two legitimate ways to combine a compound sentence. That means having two independent clauses together that are close enough in idea I want to combine them. Otherwise, just make them separate sentences. But if you want to combine them, you must combine them one of two ways. Let's go to the next page. Here are my two ways to combine two independent clauses to form a compound sentence. First is, the boy ran. Notice I have a coordinating conjunction, which you are to learn the 7, and a comma. If I only had a coordinating conjunction without the comma, it would be marked wrong. The grammar, the punctuation is incorrect. You cannot just put the word but without the comma, and you cannot just put the comma without the coordinating conjunction. This is a unit. And that was one of the big mistakes you made even going over the worksheet. You're still punctuating it wrong when you're joining to form a compound sentence. To have the comma without the coordinating conjunction is called the comma splice. But you cannot have the coordinated conjunction. Remember, and, but, for, or, nor, yet, and so. You cannot have one of those 7 words without the comma. When you are joining, you can in sentences, but not to serve the function of combining independent clause number 1 with independent clause number 2. Now, the second way, which should be used less often, only for sentences that are closely related, or we want to form some kind of parallel between them. We'll talk more about that later on when it would be the best choice to use a semicolon. But for right now, think of that as a secondary way of joining them, but do not overuse it. This, I say right now, would be your preferable way, is to think of all 7 coordinating conjunctions. If you think that these 2 ideas are related to one another, show me the one that illustrates how. Okay. Now, furthermore, you said you were asked in number 9 to define a dependent clause as opposed to an independent clause, and another word for a dependent clause is a subordinate clause. Again, 2 synonyms, dependent clause or subordinate clause. Now, this means that you have both a subject and a verb, but you do not have a complete thought. I could say, while the boy ate, and don't forget, it has nothing to do with the length of the sentence. I could say, while the small sleepy boy ate the cold pizza, and I still do not have an independent clause, because you leave me wondering, while what? While what did he eat it? Okay, so it does not express a complete thought, and it is not a sentence. Now, it can be part of a sentence, but it cannot be a sentence. And this is a great error in your work, and we would call this, if it were by itself as a sentence, trying to be a sentence, it's not a sentence, we would call it a fragment. It's not a complete idea. Okay, let's see here. I said in number 13, write 3 compound sentences joined by coordinating conjunctions. That means they all 3 want to be at the same model as number 1 above, but you want a different coordinating conjunction each time. I could have but, I could have and, I could have so, I could have for, I could have nor. Any of the 7, you want to choose a different one of these each time, but you must always have the comma. If you do not have the comma before the coordinating conjunction, and if you are not combining 2 independent clauses, then you have failed to understand the assignment. Okay, and again, we reiterated that you cannot just combine 2 independent clauses with only a comma. When I said give an example of the error discussed in number 12, you should have realized that I was asking for the one above. So number 14, I'll remodify the way I talk about that from now on. Now, that's our review from lesson 1. Now I want to go on to new ideas, sentence structure part 2, related to your current grammar worksheet. Now, the definition of a complex sentence is that it has 1 main clause, and 1 or more subordinate clauses. I could as easily have said it has one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. Now recall that a simple sentence has one main clause. A compound sentence has two or more main clauses. The other thing to recognize is that a compound sentence has no subordinate clauses, only two or more main clauses. So now we're thinking about a complex sentence. Let me give you some examples. Two examples of complex sentences, again, contains one main clause and one or more subordinate clauses. Honeybees, which beekeepers raise, live mainly in human-made hives. The main clause is kind of broken up by the subordinate clause in that example. Honeybees, which beekeepers raise, live mainly in human-made hives. Now, I'm throwing out three complex sentences here. I know they're complex sentences because I can identify in each one the subordinate clause. Let's try to do that. The subordinate clause, the main clause, is honeybees live, mainly in human-made hives. Honeybees live would be my main subject and my main verb, and the main clause would be honeybees live mainly in human-made hives. And if that was all I would say in that sentence, it would make total sense. It stands alone. It expresses a complete thought. In the next one, the main idea that would stand all alone would be honeybees are even more valuable as pollinators, right here. Okay. Honeybees are even more valuable than as pollinators would be a sentence that makes complete sense all by itself. In the last one, they inadvertently spread pollen. That makes sense all by itself. The rest, the subordinate clause, I'm going to do in another color here, it gives additional information but cannot be a sentence by itself. Which beekeepers raise, although their honey is valuable, as they move from flower to flower. That's the secondary clause. It also has a subject and a verb. Beekeepers raise. Honey is, that's the subject, is valuable. They move. There's a subject and a verb in every dependent clause, but the dependent clause cannot be alone. It does not express a complete thought. The independent clause, in this case marked out by the red, is the one that expresses a complete thought and is not dependent on anything else to make complete sense. Now, how do you notice? Let's see how we punctuate this. So let me read a few more complex sentences. For instance, he forgot to give the teacher his homework when he came to class late. The part that's dependent on the other part is the clause when he came to class late, or when he came late to class, sorry. And so that would be the dependent clause. It comes at the end of the sentence, no comma. Here's another one. The teacher asked for his homework after she noticed it was missing. After she noticed it was missing is the dependent clause. It comes at the end of the sentence, no comma. Here's another one. Even though I would rather go to the beach, I went to the library to study. The dependent clause is, even though I would rather go to the beach, it's at the beginning of the sentence, so I must have a comma. Even though I would rather go to the beach, comma, I went to the library to study. Here's another one. Some students skipped studying because the weather was gorgeous outside. Because the weather was gorgeous outside is the subordinate clause. It's at the end of the sentence, no comma. Since it's hard to resist a sunny day, some teachers hold class outside. Since it's hard to resist a sunny day is the subordinate clause, comes at the beginning of a sentence, there is a comma. Now, subordinate clauses are always introduced with a subordinate conjunction, and here there are lots of subordinating conjunctions, many more than I've listed, but here gives you an idea of some of the words that are commonly used as subordinate conjunctions: after, although, as if, because, even though, if, in order that, since, though. Moving to the next page. Unless, until, when, where, whereas, whether, while. Now, just because these words are used as subordinate conjunctions doesn't mean that that's the only way we use them. In other words, to be a subordinate conjunction, it's going to be before a dependent clause. In other words, I could say, we will work until 9 o'clock. And 9 o'clock by itself, I have the word until, but 9 o'clock by itself is not a clause. Okay, so be careful. You're always thinking in terms of job. What job is this group of words doing in the sentence? Now, I realize that this tape is already very long, and so I want you to skip number 14 and number 15. We will do those in next week's tape and talk about the whole subject of compound complex sentence later. Okay, so this should be, again, a good foundation for answering these questions. Make sure you truly do understand them. It really is frustrating for me when I ask you to write the examples. So I'm telling you, those are very important questions to me, because if you write the examples and you're mispunctuating them, you've missed the point of the exercise. So make sure that if you don't understand from this tape, you get yourself additional help, whatever grammar book or online resource you need to make it make sense to you before you come back to class. We will begin to have a grammar question as part of our quizzes and have totally separate quizzes on grammar structure any week now, from any time on. So you come to class prepared for a quiz in this subject.